Good morning to all of you gathered here. This is the 10th day of our 21-day program on human rights online. 10 days is a long time. And all of you have withstood the 10 days, excepting perhaps the one or two who have something very special on certain days, and that is perfectly understandable. You all have your YouTube backup to be able to listen and re-listen to ensure that this is really your stuff. Friends, we have started with the definition on human rights as the right to life, the right to equality, the right to liberty, and the right to the dignity of the individual. And thereafter, we have moved on to see the principles of human rights. And then we went on to see what women's rights are, what children's rights are, what Dalit rights are, what Adivasi rights are, what the rights of the denotified tribes in this country are, that manual scavengers also have rights. We have gone into food, the right to food, the right to housing, the right of the LGBTQI, right to environment, religious minorities, labor rights are human rights, the right to freedom of expression and speech, the right to information, the right to associate and assemble. And today, friends, we are on right of the elderly, on the right to health, on the right of refugees. Refugees have human rights, and of course, on the right to education. They're all interconnected. Each one of them are interconnected. We have disseminated, we have dissected them for the purpose of study, but they're all interconnected. The elderly have a right to food, the elderly have a right to housing, the elderly have a right to speech, the elderly have a right to associate, the elderly have a right to assemble, etc., etc., etc. We cannot but have the person in the country, a very close friend of ours, Mr. Matthew Cherian, the CEO of HelpAge India, today to lead us into this discussion that on the rights of elders. It is very important for my academic friends to see his background. Mr. Matthew Cherian is a B Honours in Civil Engineering from BITS, Pilani, Rajasthan, and holds a PG Diploma in Rural Management from the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, Gujarat. After completing engineering, he went on to oil exploration, and from there to cooperatives, and then landed up as the director of the most prestigious NGO globally, their Indian unit, Oxfam India. He was their director from 1987 to 1994. He also serves as a member of the NGO task force of the Planning Commission, member of the Grants Approval Committee of the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, member of the core group of the NHRC, about which you will come to know in a few days, member of the high-level committee on corporate social responsibility of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, and an amicus to the Supreme Court in the elder rights matter for pensions, homes, and the maintenance law, which has helped bring elders' issues to the forefront. As the CEO, he has been the CEO of HelpAge India, about which all of you know, for the last 16 long years, and serves on the board of the international bodies, GuideStar International, HelpAge International, etc. Member of the Global Future Council of World Economy for Forum, the foremost interdisciplinary knowledge network for promoting innovative thinking to shape a sustainable and inclusive future. Matthew has been very closely associated with People's Watch. He's been generous enough in the days when we needed him to offer pro bono service in our financial management as a member of our financial advisory committee at the national level, all pro bono. He has been a good friend in times of very great difficulties for us. Always supportive, always encouraging, and always interlinking the concerns of the elderly with the current human rights demands. He had also chaired the voluntary association, the Vani, which is the body of all the voluntary organizations across the country. He had been the president a short while ago. Matthew, we are very happy to have you.
Thank you.
Very happy that these 180 participants will hear you, and they will see the linkages that you bring between the rights of the elderly and human rights in general. Welcome. The floor is yours. I come back after 28 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you for those long introduction. And of course, to put it very simply, Henry and me have been fellow travelers in NHRC and later also in the human rights movement. And so today, of course, I look at elderly and disability rights in the NHRC, which of course, in my opinion, is going down into a defunct body. That is like opening remarks for all you students of human rights. So that is something which is there. So I'm going to begin by sharing a screen, and can you all see it? Is it visible, Karnanji?
Yes.
And what is happening in India is that we have become world champions in baby production, and India has become the biggest world champions in producing babies, and as a result of it, we have what is called as the demographic explosion, which is there. And in 1 hour, we produce 351 babies, whereas China produces only 244 babies, and the US produces 60 babies. But all of us have to age. It is a simple truth that all of us have to age, and the world is aging fast, including India. And if you look at the world population by age group, we will soon be touching 7 billion. And India's population of elderly is currently about 110 million. And by 2050, that is when I think most of us will be very old. The 1 in 4 people in this country will be older person. So that is the reality. And this is a curve which I want all of you to understand, that this is what is known as the life course of everybody, including you and me. So when we start off, we are actually very small. And when we are in the mother's womb, we are just less than 3.5 kg. And then slowly we start growing into huge people, and we maintain growth. And the growth is maintained due to the food we eat and the exercise that we do. But as we grow old, what happens is, because of eating the wrong food and eating also exercising very, very less, many of you may not be even waking up early, and some of you may have woken up early today to attend this course. So nobody does enough exercise in the morning. As a result of it, your disability starts going down, which means you start becoming more and more disabled. And once you cross the 60 years, the dotted line is when the adult life moves into older age, and then you get into what is known as the disability curve, and your fitness gap. At my age, most of you will start developing problems in your back, in your shoulder, in your knees, various kinds. And this disability is due to the fitness gap in human beings. So one advice to all of you before you understand human rights is eat food in moderation, and also exercise as much as you can. So, and then we want to inform all of you that the rights of the elderly does not have a common language. And what has happened is, as you grow older, when you're a child, you have the Convention for the Rights of the Child. Women have Convention for Discrimination Against Women. And as we grow older, elderly seem to have no rights. And the international law on older people is very, very meager. And as a result of it, we have no common language for an international law for elderly, which implies there is no convention for the older people, or there is no elderly rights which is there. So I'll come to that in a later stage. Now what happens is, today we are facing a pandemic, and we are also facing a disaster which is going to strike West Bengal, and in form of cyclone. So what happens is, there are only international treaties and conventions which are only binding if signed and ratified. So this is what happens when you have such only weak conventions. What we have is, in the elderly field, is only soft laws. Like one soft law is the law of the sea, which is a soft law and cannot be implemented very much. Like that, elderly have something which is called a declaration, which was made in Madrid in Spain in 1999, called the Madrid Plan of Action. So I'll come to that. And the Madrid Plan of Action had was signed by and ratified by all countries, and it said that older persons have a right to development, and older persons have a right to health, and older persons deserve ensuring, enabling, and supportive environments. And what happens in the country is, we do not have any age friendly features. If you go to your buses, and your buses even in Tamil Nadu and in Madurai, etc., older people find it difficult to climb into buses. The buildings do not have access, and we do not have an enabling environment in most buildings. So if older people have a right to development, they have also an access into public buildings, access into hospitals, etc. It is something that HelpAge has been working on. And so these are three rights which is enshrined for older people as declared in the Madrid Plan of Action. And of course, you might have dealt with all this Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant, etc. And I'm not going to get into it. And you might have done it in the earlier courses which were done in. So elderly have a small portion of the rights emanating from these, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, what is happening is, the root of human rights law is based on non-discrimination. So we say that elderly have a right to livelihood, and in turn a right to life. Because if you go to the street, you will find a, a tea maker who is old, you will find a rickshaw puller who is old, and they have a right to livelihood. Because in this country, we do not have a pension, we do not have a provident fund for most unorganized labor. And you're seeing today the state of migrants. The migrants are in such a state because of COVID, but not because of really COVID, but because we do not have a right of social security. Unless we have social security, old age for all of us will be quite miserable. So we need some financial protection in the form of pension, in the form of provident funds, or in the form of any. There is also a right to health. If we look at the health for geriatric people, that is, geriatric people are those people who are above 60, which includes me. Uh, and so what happens is, we do not have any kind of facilities for older patients in district hospitals or in the villages. The only geriatric hospital in Tamil Nadu is in the Madras Medical College in Chennai. That is the only geriatric hospital available for older people. So rest of Tamil Nadu doesn't have. So the same situation is there in most of the states. So we in HelpAge do a lot of medical work, and we say fundamental right to health should be there for all older people in the country. And there is also exploitation and elder abuse. And People's Watch and we had also done seminars and discussions on elder abuse, because most older people are now being abused in the family, and the family abuse is mostly by the sons and followed by the daughter-in-law. So both sons and daughter-in-law are exploiting the older people, and very often the cases for exploitation is due to property which is at home. Then there is also violence against older women, and there is also, as soon as a woman becomes a widow, especially in North India and in Bengal, they then thrown out of their home and they end up on the streets of Vrindavan in Mathura, or they end up in Varanasi, or they end up in Haridwar in religious places. And the same is true about other communities also in India. So there is a huge exploitation, especially against older women, and this continues across the thing. And if you come to humanitarian law, the humanitarian law is completely different to human rights law. And today in the corona pandemic, we also say that elderly have rights. Elderly have a right to life. You can't keep them indoors in lockdown and say that you cannot come out because you are a high risk. So, but we also have a right to be come out. We also have a right to protection. We also have a right to food. And as a result of it, and these are all enshrined in humanitarian law, which is available uh, for most older people. And this humanitarian law is now being denied to older people, and we do not get ration, we do not get pension. And HelpAge India has been working for providing ration and other medical relief across the country. Currently, we are working in about 125 districts, passing on food rations, because unfortunately this country does not provide ration to older people, because many of them do not have a simple white ration card. So the right to food eludes them. Now, if you look at the Indian experience, and if you look at the map of India, the southern states of Tamil Nadu and Kerala have aged rapidly. The state of Maharashtra has also aged, and the state of Orissa, Punjab, and Haryana have also aged. The rest of the country, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, which is coming on your screen in light pink, are younger states. And in the southern states, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana and Karnataka are still young states. As a result of it, my state, I come from Kerala, my state has got the oldest proportion of elderly. We have crossed the 12% mark for elderly. So Kerala is increasingly old, but thanks to the Kerala government, many of the older people at risk were protected fairly well, and but which is not going to be the case in the coming states of coming few periods. It will not be the state. Now, if you look at we have produced studies on elder abuse, and we find that older people help. If you go to our website, you will be able to download the report. I'm only bringing you a short summary of it. And what has happened is most older people have experienced elder abuse. And as I mentioned earlier, bulk of them have faced elder abuse due to children wanting the property in their lifetime. Whereas in my age, people used to wait for their parents to pass away before they got the property from them. But today they all want to have their property before the parents die. So 25% of the elderly surveyed in us, 1 in 4 persons have faced abuse in the past, and the abuse has always been by their children and by their daughters-in-law. So this has been some of the areas, and the type of abuse has most of you are in the case of studying human rights. Lot of abuse is due to neglect. In fact, older people will be served food after the entire family has eaten. In many cases, older people are served food in the kitchen. And even in your state of Tamil Nadu, in Virudhunagar, they were killing off older people with an extremely violent form of practice called the Talai Kutal. And in Talai Kutal, especially in the month of Margari, which is December 15th to January 14th, many older people have been knocked off, and Helpage was appointed by the Tamil Nadu government as a monitor against such abuse. So we work in the district of Virudhunagar to prevent uh, not only abuse, to prevent the killing of older people uh, by the younger people in the family. And I would also like to say that when we did this survey of elder abuse across cities, we found it was more or less uniform across the country. There is no reason to say that only South abuse. So our study says across the country, the amount of abuse to older people is continuously very important. And we think there should be a law. And there was a law in 2007 called the Maintenance of Parents Welfare Bill, which was passed in 2007, which I'll come to it later. And so the median age of the main perpetrators were 42 years. As I mentioned to you, 52% was the son, 34% was the daughter-in-law, and spouses of their daughters also abused, 14%. The daughters by percentage abused about 6%. So this was, and bulk of it, if you look at the causes, were on the issues of property and also money. They wanted the pension to be attached to them. They wanted the fixed deposits to be linked to the name, and all kinds of issues like that. So these have been some of the reasons. And we feel that unless older people are protected, this abuse will become a serious issue. And this was also placed with the National Human Rights Commission, this report. And the Human Rights has taken cognizance of it and written to the Government of India that stricter laws for punishing children should be passed. So this is the background to the maintenance law. And if you look at it, widows also have a right to maintenance. Prior to 2007, we only had section 125 of the CRPC, which was providing for maintenance rights. And as some of you may be having a legal background, the CRPC is a very long procedure. And by the time the older people received any justice, they had also died, because the justice system in this country is so long. And as a result of it, we need to look at various kinds of other measures to protect them, which may be social measures, which may be measures by human rights defenders, which may be by NGOs, which may be by other kinds of parties. So, and if you look at it, most of the people would my screen is locked, so can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So what has happened is the screen has got locked. So I'm I'm going to continue talking about the maintenance law. So in 2007, the maintenance law was passed by the parliament, and it said that any child who abuses the parent will have to the parent will have to file a simple letter, either to the district magistrate or the subdivisional magistrate, or uh, even an NGO can also file a complaint with the SDM or the DM in the districts. And if it is in other areas, they can even file it with what is known as the Ministry of Social Welfare. And this is something which is needed to do. But what happened is, this maintenance law was a central act, and all state governments had to pass similar laws so that they could pass on these laws to the people. And so the Tamil Nadu, of course, passed it. Kerala passed it. Only about 20 states have passed the maintenance law in their own states. The remaining states, the 9 states, are still to pass this law. And we have also, when we did an evaluation of this act in 2017, 10 years after it was passed, we found that it was still a weak law. The people never used to implement the strictures passed by the maintenance tribunal. In many cases, we found in Kerala, uh, children used to pay the maintenance for 3 4 months. After that, they used to stop paying, and they had to go back to the district magistrate to complain against their children. And as a result of it, it was quite a quite a weak law. So in 2017, we pressed the government of India to pass an amendment to this law. So an amendment to this law has been passed by the parliament. So this amendment is now placed in the parliament, and it was placed as the amendment to the Maintenance and Welfare of Parents Bill 2019, that is last year. But by December, the government has referred this bill to the Parliamentary Committee on Social Justice and Empowerment. So it is still lying with the Parliamentary Committee. Meanwhile, COVID has intervened and everything is at a standstill. So that is the state of the law. And I have to mention about the elderly rights case which was filed in the Supreme Court. This was a PIL filed by Dr. Ashwini Kumar, indicating that bulk of the older people were not receiving their right to food. They were not receiving.
Mute பண்ணிட்டேன்.
Carry on. Carry on.
So they were not receiving their pensions, and as you know, in this country, only about 19 million out of the 106 million receive any form of pension, and that too, it is only 200 rupees per month. That is the pension offered by the government of India, which is called the Indira Gandhi Old Age Pension. The second area is that only about 106 districts in the country have any geriatric health facilities in the state, and Ashwini Kumar's prayer was that the pension should be increased, the pension should be universalized, and the healthcare should also go to all the districts of the country. And wherever you have destitute elderly, there should be at least one old age home in every district. And in this case, the Supreme Court had appointed me as the amicus. And finally, Justice Madan Lokur gave the judgment in December 2019, which said pension should be increased. The right to food should be ensured in all the districts of the country. And also that old age homes should come up in every district of the country, so that those destitute elderly and homeless elderly and elderly thrown out by their children onto the streets can be at least housed in old age homes and provided shelter. So this has been the judgment of the Supreme Court, and also said elderly have rights. Elderly have right to food, elderly have right to pension, elderly have right to health. So I think this was a substantial victory. But today, as I speak, because of the COVID crisis, we are also filing, Dr. Ashwini Kumar is filing as we speak in the Supreme Court, telling that due to COVID, we have not been able to provide food, nor pensions, nor rations to various elderly people. And we should be able to, Government of India should post haste provide these facilities at the rural level. So there is an application being filed in the court. And because we find due to COVID, millions of elderly are not being provided food, not being provided pension at the doorstep. So as a result of it, we think not only do elderly have rights to a reasonable pension, right to a reasonable health, and right to also a comfortable stay in an old age home if they require so. And my reminder to all my young colleagues attending the course is all of you will grow old. And if you do not fight for pension, when you grow old, you will find that this country does not support you. And Article 21, which promises right to life, is not a right available for older people. So please join us in our struggle to fight for pensions, for fight for food, and to fight for healthcare. If we can't do these three, I think we will be failing in our duty as a human rights defender for older people. I'm going to stop here and leave time for questions.
Thank you, Matthew Cherian. There are two questions that have just come in. So I was just reading them just a minute back they arrived. The first question is, the properties given to son or daughter by parents can be taken from them when they do not take care of the parents. So elder people, when they, you spoke about nowadays people don't wait for handing over the property. So it's a question in that particular context. Yes, if you can respond to that, I'll just read the other questions that have just come in.
Yeah, actually, under the maintenance. Phone mute பண்ணுங்க. Okay.
I muted them, yeah.
Okay. And so property actually can be reversed under the maintenance law, but it takes a fair amount of time. And most parents, we have noticed under the maintenance law, when it comes to those decisions, they try to reconcile with the children and they then withdraw the complaint. So usually this property reversal in many cases does not take place. There is one landmark case in the Madurai High Court where a property was reversed, and this was an industrial one person who owned a factory, and he got his property reversed because his children were abusing them at home. So that there are cases available, but in 99% of the cases, property does not get reversed.
Yes. Another question is, now given the situation of elderly you spoke about, and with governments not implementing what they're supposed to do for the protection of elderly so that they are able to access all rights, one person is asking, is it the failure of the government completely, or also with regard to the civil society, they were not able to comprehensively raise this question?
No, the failure is on different scores. First of all, it is a failure. Before you blame civil society, it is a failure of our own family system, because today in many families, elderly don't seem to be wanted, and as a result of it, that is the beginning of the problem. So wherever I go to schools and colleges, I tell the youngsters that you should take care of your parents. This is your fundamental duty which you have to do, and most people are not doing it. Then of course it degenerates into a situation of elder abuse, and also an attempt to grab the property of older people. So this is going on in all parts of the country, and as I showed you in the report, this is going on in most states of India. But of course, the government's failure, we have seen the government's failure is in implementation of this maintenance law, which has been badly implemented in many states. And it is also a poor implementation of the National Food Security Act, because the NFSA should have been implemented in all districts, and very few states have implemented NFSA in its full measure. So most elderly do not have a right to food as well. So when thrown out by your own children onto the streets, then you don't have a right to food, you don't have a right to shelter, you don't have anything. Then you end up as a homeless, destitute people. And I I have mentioned to many people, when I go to Chennai, I see a lot of older people on the streets as homeless. So in Chennai, we are running homeless shelters. We are also trying to rescue people from the streets of Chennai and put them in old age homes. We also have a helpline, 1-800-180-1253. And this helpline works in 23 states. And we have been constantly rescuing people. So I would say the failure is first by individuals in the family, next by civil society, and then by government. So all of us are responsible if our elderly are not taken care of.
Thank you. And there have been a couple of questions and comments with regard to pension and social security. Now, what people are like, what I can comprehend, what people have asked, they would like to know the status of the old age pension implementation in India. And are people able to access the old age pension in a timely manner? And is the quantum adequate for the elderly?
Actually, the pension country is completely flawed, and we have something called the National Social Assistance Program, NSAP. The NSAP provides for pension to elderly people and widows and disabled people, and of course the elderly people who are below. All of this is below the poverty line. There is no scheme for people above the poverty line. So in 2003 the amount was revised to 200 rupees per month, the central contribution, which is for both widows and as well as uh, elderly and disabled people. There's a 200 rupee pension by the central government. It is a central scheme. Now what is happening is, if you go to the rural areas, this below poverty line BPL cards have been a source of complete corruption, and various kinds of attempts have been made to reform the BPL system. And finally, in 2011, the government came up with a socio-economic caste census, which is SECC 2011. The SECC 2011 then appointed a committee under the chairmanship of Sumit Bose, which is also referred to as the Sumit Bose Committee report. And in 2016, they gave a report telling that SECC should be used as a criteria for identification of the poor. In this report, they identified 53.3 million elderly below the poverty line. Because as you all know that as you grow old, you have no income, you have no work. As a result of it, you're very, very poor. So 53.3 have been, but till date, the government still continues with the old BPL system. Only 19 million people are provided pension. And as a result of it, and to 200 rupees. Then after a lot of advocacy, state governments then started increasing their contribution. For example, during the period when Jayalalitha was the chief minister of Tamil Nadu, she increased the pension for Tamil Nadu to 2,000 rupees per month. And so this is the central contribution, and 1,800 rupees is the state government's contribution. So 2,000 rupees. And so 3 states of India, Goa, Tamil Nadu, and Delhi offer 2,000 rupee pension, whereas states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh still offer 300 rupees pension. So does the state of Assam, which is 300 rupees. So this varies across states, and there's not enough time to tell about it. But what we have been working with Pension Parishad and trying to argue that this pension should be universalized, so that every human being who deserves a pension in old age should be given a pension. So that is what we want ultimately, so that they have a right to social security. So that is the state of pensions in this country.
Thank you very much for an elaborative answer. Just one final question. You mentioned with regard to humanitarian laws with regard to elderly. Is it a part of the same international humanitarian law which deals with conflict situations?
Yeah, humanitarian law can be applied in conflict situation. It can be applied even in a famine situation. But however, it does not apply in the case of pandemics, and because the epidemic act then takes over in many countries. And so what happens is, it doesn't seem to apply in, maybe Henry can look at the nuances of this, but it doesn't apply at this moment. But suppose a cyclone hits West Bengal, then the humanitarian law will get applicable. So there are, but I have to understand that whether it is a pandemic or whether it is a disaster, the fundamental human rights law should be applicable. That means they all should have a right to food, they all should have a right to health, and they should have a right to pension. So our current uh, demand from the government is all elderly people should be provided a pension and a ration during, because you are asking them to stay indoors during lockdown. And how are they going to survive if you are not going to provide them with these fundamental entitlements?
Thank you very much. Henry, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you. Thank you very much. Matthew Cherian, can you also repeat the helpline number so that we are able to put it on the chat?
The helpline number is 1-800-180-1253.
Rajavel, did you get it?
I will put it on the chat also.
No, it is already there.
It's there?
1-800-180-1253.
Yeah.
Correct. We've got it. It is on the chat. And
Okay.
friends, this is important that you have it. HelpAge India, whose CEO is Matthew Cherian, has this helpline. And I'm sure all of you here, when you are in the knowledge of the elderly whose rights are being abused, and you want some intervention to be done, and you feel you have nowhere to go, please go to HelpAge India, and HelpAge India will then redirect you perhaps to the local person who's their contact, or with a number of partners and associates with whom HelpAge India works. So this helpline number will be very useful. Thank you very much, Matthew, for being with us. It's important for all of us to know how serious this problem is. Recently, I had a very strong, motivating, powerful woman activist in Chennai who was shattered, completely shattered by what she saw happening to the elderly. And this was from the Anna Nagar area of Chennai. And those of you who know Chennai, by the way, Matthew, we have people from 17 states here.
Okay. Not from Tamil.
It's not my backyard at all.
Okay.
And in Anna Nagar, you had an elderly lady who, through a conspiracy worked by the Corporation of Chennai, the police, and an NGO running these shelters, managed to catch hold of an old lady only because they knew that this lady owned a lot of property. And imagine she owned something in Anna Nagar, and there were other properties also. She was, and the network and the conspiracy was so strong, it went even up to the, and I'm saying it on record, up to the office of the Chief Minister, where IAS officers were connected. I mean, we were totally shocked to hear this. And one of my colleagues, who's a facilitator in this group, I had to go to that person and then work with her, and then we are yet to unravel the whole thing by which this COVID situation arose. So the elderly are really abused, and there is a whole system of abuse where a lot of people conspire together. And I think it's important that we all are aware that elders' rights are human rights. The NHRC has done its part in constituting a committee, and then the rest, I think, Matthew Cherian said it in his opening remarks. But it's important to know that the UN Special Rapporteurs in the list of thematic concerns, the right of the elderly has also found place recently. So this is an ongoing field in the field of human rights, and therefore we thought we would include. It happens, it's connected to each one of our homes. Thank you, Matthew, for being with us.
Thank you, Henry.
We have our next speaker. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Can you identify yourself? I saw you enter.
Hello.
In fact,
there is some problem with my camera, which I just discovered. So I think I'll have to shift to my laptop if you want to see me. Otherwise, I suppose you can hear me and see my
we can hear you, and I'm going to show a photograph of you so people
okay,
will
fine.
how you
So then
like.
I think we can skip the camera. I mean,
And the PowerPoint, you having PowerPoints?
yeah, I have a PowerPoint.
And is Rajavela, are you handling the PowerPoint?
He will himself share it. Is
Okay.
that okay, Doctor, or should I share it?
Abhay, you will handle the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'm just showing it.
No problem. I'll start with an introduction.
Yeah, you can do that.
Just hold on. I have a duty now.
Yeah, sure.
To show your photograph. Yes. So Abhay, welcome to this 21-day program that we are currently engaged in organizing, where we have participants from 17 states, as I was already mentioning to you earlier. And just reminding you once again, we have people from all walks of life here, and therefore they are anxiously waiting to listen to you. Dear friends, Abhay Shukla is a public health physician with a graduate and postgraduate degree from the Alderney Institute of Medical Sciences, has been working on health issues in collaboration with civil society. He is very humble in saying in Western India, I say throughout the country. He's a senior program officer, coordinator at Satipur in Pune, along with being a member of the National Health Mission Advisory Group for Community Action. He is also a member of the National Core Group on Health of the NHRC. You will now see this NHRC business coming more and more. This is how NHRC brings the best known people across the country, the best talented people across the country into their core committees. But what they do, I think I will leave it to the speakers to talk. He's also one of the national conveners of the People's Health Movement in India. It's important for you to know that there is a People's Health Movement in India. And I can see that in our audience, we have Advocate Martin from the city of Tiruchirappalli in Tamil Nadu, who's also connected the People's Health Movement. He was also sent in National Right to Healthcare campaign during 2003-04. Founders of the National Network Alliance of Doctors for Ethical Healthcare, new terminologies for many of us. Member of the National Commission Committee constituted by the Health Ministry for the National Health Bill 2009. Member of the Advisory Committee of Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, experts to states after they have drafting the pioneering right to health legislations. He has also co-edited several books, and I will stop here. Friends, it's important to know that right to health is a part of right to life. This is what we said in the first day. Here is Dr. Abhay Shukla with us, expanding that. Over to you, Doctor. I'll come back after 28 minutes exactly, or in fact, it will be Matthew Jacob from the office in Delhi who will come back to you. Since you'll have to excuse me. The participants have to excuse me today. I will have to wriggle out at about 10:15 because I have a case at 10:30. which is also in court, which is on equipment. The Madurai High Court. So that I will not be there towards it. Matthew will do the coordination.
Okay. Should I start?
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. Can you see the slide, the presentation?
We can see it.
We
Okay,
can.
fine.
We can.
Great. Okay, great. So I think the slides are more important. Seeing the slides are more important than seeing me. So thanks a lot, Henry, for giving that brief introduction. And yeah, it's great. And I thank the organizers for inviting me to make this presentation during the course. And I'll be talking about the right to health, as you know. And so before starting on the presentation, I'll take you on a trip because, in the time of lockdown, we cannot move out of our houses, most of us, but I'll take you on an interesting trip to a country just to, make, the thing, the whole experience a little more interesting. And of course, it's a virtual trip. And we are going to a strange country, which it's a large and interesting country. And we'll look at people's health in this country. It has among the largest number of medical colleges in the world. It produces a very large number of doctors which are exported to many other countries. It gets medical tourists from across the world because its hospitals are considered to be very good, among the best in the world. And it's one of the largest producers of drugs and exporters of medicines across the world. So it's producing a lot of doctors, very high quality doctors, very high tech hospitals, and huge amount of medicines. So you would think that this country would have a very good standard of health. But the same country has less than half of the children are immunized. It has a very large number of, the largest number of maternal deaths in the world, the largest number of TB patients, second largest number of HIV positive persons, and it has one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world. And most citizens have very limited access to quality healthcare. So you must have guessed what this interesting country is. This is the paradoxical country which we all live in. And in this country, we have a coexistence of the most modern technology, high-tech hospitals, very highly qualified doctors, and large number of medical colleges, production of medicines, and also a gross denial of basic health services. It's a country of paradoxes, as you all know. And we have considerable healthcare resources, but poor access to healthcare for the majority of the population. People pay a lot for healthcare from their own pockets because the government does not pay enough. People have to pay themselves for healthcare. And yet people do not enjoy adequate access to quality healthcare. And there seems to be something wrong with the health system, which is responsible for this situation. Majority of people cannot access basic health services, and therefore Therefore, we need health rights to demand people's entitlements. So now these two things are linked. So I will not talk about health rights in a purely legalistic framework. I will talk about health rights in a much more socially contextualized kind of setting, looking at what are the issues which people face regarding access to healthcare and how that is linked with the entire movement for health rights. Now, because I am the co-host, I think there is this this is continuously coming in. I don't know if I can completely remove it. Anyway.
So can you be a bit loud? Some participants have shared that your audio is...
Okay. Can you hear me better now?
Much better, much better.
Okay. So can you see the complete screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fine. So let us see how health rights have actually emerged in India on the agenda. there is a context to this. Since the 1990s, there has been a deterioration in public health services, stagnant and declining public health budgets, and at the same time, sharp rise in costs of private medical care. The negative impacts of liberalization, privatization, and globalization on the health sector. This is the entire setting in which, social economic rights, not only the right to health, but also the right to education, the right to food, the right to employment, and various other social economic rights have emerged on the agenda. And as we know that when policies and systems are weakened, then the demand for rights is strengthened. So in this setting, let us now quickly look at the conceptual issues, and then we'll come to the more practical kind of approaches related to the right to health. Now, what is the right to health? Now, it is not a right to be healthy, because any of us being healthy depends on a whole range of external circumstances, of course, but it also depends on individual susceptibility and personal behavior, which cannot be addressed by the state directly. So therefore, the right to health is the enjoyment of a variety of facilities and conditions necessary for realization of the highest attainable standard of health. This is important to note. It's a right to facilities and conditions necessary for the best standard of health that is possible. Now, this changes from period to period. It changes even from country to country over time, the set of facilities and conditions. But it is something which is more concrete, which can be demanded from the state, and the state becomes a duty bearer in most situations, and people can claim their rights from the state. And as WHO, so this is from the General Comment 14, which I'll be coming to very soon, and it's also a claim to a set of social arrangements which can, so ensure the right. Now, what are the two main components of the right to health? The right to health consists of the right to health care, which is delivered by health systems, by health services, by public and private health sector, and the right to determinants of health, such as water, sanitation, food, nutrition, housing, environment, and so on. So it's a combination of two kinds of rights. And in this presentation, we'll be primarily talking about the right to health care. Not because the right to health in a broader sense is not important, it is very important, but what is directly addressed at the health system is the right to health care. And health care are the range of services which are delivered with the explicit and primary purpose of improving people's health. Now, what is the justification for the right to health? You must have already discussed the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Article 12 basically says that all the countries which are part of the covenant, they recognize the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of health. India has ratified this covenant, as you know, and based on this covenant, General Comment 14 has basically elaborated on the right to health. And if you're interested in knowing more about the international framework for right to health, I would encourage you to read General Comment 14. There are other major international conventions, such as, of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, CEDAW, which is related to discrimination against women, and the CRC, which is on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. All of these also reiterate and speak about the right to health as a core obligation. In the Indian Constitution, in the directive principles, Article 47 talks about the duty of the state to raise the level of nutrition and standard of living and to improve public health. Now, this is a bit broad and generic. Unfortunately, until now, the right to health or the right to health care are not constitutional rights. They are not part of the fundamental rights, but still, we have some basis in the Constitution to talk about the right to health. Because of this situation, it is actually the Supreme Court which has repeatedly stepped in, and also certain high courts which have actually elaborated upon this, and in various judgments, they have talked about the right to health or the right to health care being a right flowing from Article 21, which, as you know, is the right to life in the Indian Constitution. So, what we can say about the right to health care is that today in India, it is an implicit right based on the right to life, Article 21. But now this needs to be made more explicit and justiciable and operational. Now, before we go ahead, I would just like to point out that when we start talking about health rights, we also need to talk about health systems. Because the right to health, of course, it has all three components of respect, protect, and fulfill. But there is a large component of fulfillment where the state is supposed to provide certain services of good quality, free of charge to everyone, which are accessible without discrimination, etc. And therefore, we need to look at health systems. So, where do health rights actually come in the picture? The various sections of people who today do not have adequate access to health services, they basically, first of all, need to understand and mobilize around their health rights. And when this is done, they can bring the health system closer to the people and actually ensure that the health system starts delivering or improves its delivery of health services and therefore fulfills people's health rights. And now we have developed a campaign around the right to health care in India. And while right to health remains the larger perspective, right to health care is a more focused campaign strategy which takes different forms in context of public health services and private healthcare. This is another point which we need to keep in mind, that these two large parts of the health system have to be dealt with separately or in a somewhat different way. And as we have developed the right to healthcare campaign, this has been combined with advocacy for reforms in the health system. So in a sense, a lot of the work of the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan has been a combination of demanding health rights and working with the health system to improve its delivery of health services so that people's health rights can be ensured. The journey of health rights in India probably starts in an organized way since the early 2000s. In Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh, certain people's organizations pioneered a certain variety of health rights initiatives. Of course, there would have been others also, but this was in a more explicit form. People organizing to demand the primary healthcare system to deliver health services and improve their functioning so that people could gain their health rights. And these were some of the initial experiences which gave us a perspective about how people can start getting organized around their health rights. Following this, in the year 2000, across the country, the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan or People's Health Movement was formed by a large-scale national mobilization process involving almost 20 states across the country. More than 2,000 health activists came together in a national health assembly and decided to form a continued campaign platform on health rights called Jan Swasthya Abhiyan. And in 2003-4, we had the National Right to Healthcare campaign across the country where cases of denial of healthcare in the public health services were documented, surveys were conducted, followed by Jan Sunwais or public hearings in many areas. And these fed into regional public hearings in all regions of the country and followed by a national public hearing. And these public hearings were organized by JSA in collaboration with the National Human Rights Commission. And these were across the country in various regions, followed by a national public hearing. So for the first time, an official body like NHRC also recognized that the right to health and the right to health care are important human rights. Probably until then, they were not even, the right to health was not even, very explicitly looked upon as an important human right whose violations need to be viewed through a human rights framework. Now, following this, I'll share one experience of people's engagement with the health system to ensure health rights, a large-scale process which we have been doing in Maharashtra since the last 13 years nearly, called community-based monitoring and planning of health services. which a process which is supported by the National Health Mission, but which is led by civil society organizations, a network of nearly 30 civil society organizations across the state. All the colored districts which you see are districts where this process is going on, and covering, more than 1,200 villages across the state. Organized process enabling people to claim their health rights and reclaim the public health system. And this starts with, of course, mass awareness campaigns. So this is just to give you some idea how the health rights kind of process can typically unfold. So first of all, people need to become aware about their health rights. They need to know about guaranteed health services which the state is supposed to deliver at the grassroots level, at a primary health center, at a community health center, at the village level. And for that, a whole range of methods can be adopted. And then people collect information about the actual status of these health services in their village, in their PHC area, and they prepare report cards. And you can see a sample report card where good services are rated as green, bad are rated as red, and so on. And these report cards are displayed in the health facility, in the village, so that people know what is the status of their health facilities and their health rights. And following this, there are public hearings or public dialogues. More than 600 such Jan Sunwais or Jan Samwads have been organized across Maharashtra as part of this process, where hundreds of people gather and demand specific improvements in health services which are not being given adequately as per the assessment or the monitoring done by people. So this is kind of a cycle of change. People become aware about their health rights, they assess the situation in their area, and then they have a dialogue with the health officials. And in these public hearings, health officials have to respond and actually commit to change and improvements. And we call these engines of change because thousands of concrete improvements in delivery of health services in a rights-based framework have taken place. But besides the public health system, we also need to look at the private medical sector, which is huge. As you know, in our country, 70% of healthcare is given by the private sector. And in our country, this is the kind of situation. There are two contending logics. The huge and dominant logic in the health sector is what we can call the profit logic, which essentially is based on the private sector, which is profit driven, which says that people who will pay will get healthcare, people who cannot pay will not get healthcare, people who pay too much will get too much healthcare. It's not an equitable logic. It's a very inequitable logic. But against this, there is a counter logic also, which is there in the health sector, although smaller, and probably today it is weaker, and that is the social logic, which basically holds health and healthcare to be basic human rights, which must be available to all without any discrimination, without any kind of deprivation. And these two logics are today standing against each other. And the entire health rights movement is to support and strengthen and enlarge the social logic so that in the future, in the coming period, the social logic will become the dominant logic and the profit logic will become subsidiary or secondary. And this involves regulating the private sector and demanding patients' rights, even in private hospitals. And this is something which we have been doing, especially in Maharashtra, in different forms, demanding regulation of the private sector and also working for the patients' rights charter to be implemented in private hospitals across the state. And this charter is a development of the last 2 years. The NHRC, I am a member of the NHRC core group on health. I helped the NHRC to formulate a 17-point charter of patients' rights, which is applicable to all hospitals, both public and private, across the country. And this was sent to the Union Health Ministry. Then the Union Health Ministry sat on it, was not doing much. Then we had a protest in Delhi in February. And then following that, the ministry has circulated a somewhat diluted list of patients' rights and responsibilities to all states last year. So now we are, as Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, we are collaborating with the National Human Rights Commission to review implementation of this charter in various states across the country. This is the protest at Jantar Mantar in Delhi for implementation of the patients' rights charter. What is the charter? Now, this is a quite a comprehensive charter. It's one of the most comprehensive patients' rights charters in the world, which for the first time in India has been adopted by the NHRC and by the Union Health Ministry in a more brief form. But still, it's a good starting point. As you can see, these are all rights which we must enjoy in all health facilities, both public and private. The right to information, records, reports, and so on. You can see this later on, but it includes, for example, the right number 11 to choose the source for obtaining medicines or tests. No hospital can force you to get a test done or buy the medicine from their own facility. The right to take discharge of a patient or receive the body of a deceased patient, right number 15. And right number 8 is the right to transparent and affordable rates of care. These are all important rights, 17 rights, which we need to start now demanding. Many people do not even know about these rights. We need to make people aware of the Patients' Rights Charter and mobilize around it. Patients' rights are human rights. Now I will move towards concluding by talking about the People's Health Manifesto, which has been adopted by Jan Swasthya Abhiyan last year before the general elections. And this is a kind of a charter of change. And I will encourage you to go to the internet, or I can circulate it and read this People's Health Manifesto, because this links the health system issues with the health rights issues. And it basically talks about the retrograde steps. There are huge challenges, as you can imagine, regarding health rights in our country, and the current government is unfortunately, the central government is unfortunately even taking certain steps towards greater privatization, which will actually erode people's rights instead of strengthening them. And therefore, these are key proposals in the People's Health Manifesto. We are demanding a right to health care for all across the country, which will be linked to a system of universal health care, where which will involve the public health services, of course, and also regulated private hospitals working together under a publicly organized system, so that everybody gets good quality health care. And we are saying health care for all, not health cards for some. Health insurance is not a substitute for health rights. And massive increase in public health funding and strengthening of public health services, free essential medicines for all, regularizing contractual health workers, health rights for socially, economically disadvantaged communities, Dalits, Adivasis, women, differently abled people, children, elderly people, etc., etc., people living with HIV. So the whole range of people who have special health needs, these must be fulfilled. And regulation of the private health sector, ensuring patients' rights even in the private health sector, including regulation of rates and standards of care. Completely, withdrawing all proposals for privatization of healthcare and generalizing community monitoring. So finally, what are our health rights in the time of COVID-19? As you know, today, public health systems in many states are under strain because they are struggling to provide outreach services, the epidemic controls activities, surveillance, case detection, testing, isolation of, contact tracing, home quarantine, etc., etc., and also clinical services. So in this situation, we are seeing that many patients are facing a situation where they are unable to access care, in some cases for COVID-19 and in all many cases for general health services, because some public facilities have been converted into COVID-19 facilities, and therefore people may not be able to access the usual services for deliveries, emergencies, dialysis, cancer care, and many other situations. And the lockdown has also created barriers to accessing healthcare in many parts of the country. And in the situation of COVID-19, the private sector is more of part of the problem than the solution in many places. Many private doctors have shut down their clinics, and some hospitals have been denying care to COVID-19 patients. And there are also reports of gross overcharging. Like in Mumbai, in one private hospital, they were charging 1 lakh rupees per day for a patient with COVID-19. So anyway, this is the kind of situation. It's a challenging situation, but it's also a situation, the COVID-19 epidemic has created an environment for greater public attention to health issues and building solidarity around the right to health care. So finally, what can we do to join others working on health rights? So I would encourage all of you who are interested to study the People's Health Manifesto, which is available on the internet, to look at the Patients' Rights Charter. And if you visit the NHRC website, there's a much more detailed document explaining each of the patients' rights and other such documents. Do try to be in touch with the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan or the People's Health Movement Network in your state. You can write to me, or you can I can give you email address of the National Secretariat where you can write to get contacts. Be part of the patients' rights campaign if possible. We are planning a national public hearing on private hospitals, which got interrupted because of the epidemic, but we are really trying to push for the patients' rights to be implemented in private hospitals as well across all states of India. And you can join the COVID-19 health response activities through Jan Swasthya Abhiyan or other groups which are working on the various kinds of health relief and also health rights issues related to COVID-19. So I'll conclude here with a quote which says that we find ourselves at a crossroads today. Healthcare can either be considered a commodity to be sold, or it can be considered a basic social right. It cannot be considered both of these at the same time. And this is actually the choice which we need to make in our societies, in our states, in our country. And I am sure that all of us will choose health as a right, as a basic social right, and join the struggle for the right to health. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abhay Shukla. There are a few questions which have come after a very informative session. Do you want me to put them all together to you, or do you want me to put one by one to you?
Okay. Yeah. I think maybe I can take three questions at a time, if that is possible.
Yeah, with the time we have, we can only take three. So
okay.
Should I tell you all three together now?
Yeah, please do that.
Okay. The first question is with regard to right to health. So there are a couple of participants who asked if right to health is a fundamental right, and if it is read with right to life. So if you can elaborate a bit more on right to health as a fundamental right, is the first question. Second is, few participants would like to know about the universal free healthcare in India. Like, is it feasible given the population, given other situations? Some of your opinion they would like to know from your experiences.
Okay.
And something which a lot of participants were eager about was with regard to COVID pandemic and the healthcare system at the moment.
Okay.
And how it is affecting specific communities. Like, for example, one participant spoke about indigenous people. So what are measures properly taken by different state governments and central government? General question, all three, but yes, coming out from your presentation.
Okay, great. All three very important and relevant questions. And I can see that, the participants are really tuned in and, they have a good background of working on rights, I think. The first thing is the right to health a fundamental right in the Indian Constitution? No, as I already pointed out. In fact, we need to make it a fundamental right. Like something like Article 21B. So Article 21A is right to education. Article 21B can be right to health or right to health care. So even though it is not a fundamental right, that does not mean that we cannot demand it. In fact, we have to demand it, and we should demand it. And there is a reasonable legal justification to demand the right to health care in India. And I already pointed out not only the directive principles in the Constitution, but also a range of Supreme Court judgments and some High Court judgments. There's a entire jurisprudence around the right to health, which you can see if you're interested. There are publications on this. So it's a good basis if you want to launch a PIL, if you want to demand the right to health. There is a reasonably strong basis to do that, but we should also in parallel work for the right to health care at least becoming a fundamental right in the Constitution. Universal healthcare. Yeah. And as you probably realize that the right to healthcare and a system of universal healthcare are like completely complementary to each other. The one reason why governments are reluctant to enact the right to health or right to health care is because they feel that they will be unable to fulfill it through universal healthcare. And I'm currently working with the state of Rajasthan. Madhya Pradesh has changed its government, so I'm not sure what's going to happen there. But at least Rajasthan, I'm hoping, will still continue with drafting a right to healthcare legislation. So now the core dilemma which comes up is that can the government give everybody, free, good quality health services at all levels, which requires a system for universal healthcare? Yes, it is. That is true. It is a challenge. It is not something so straightforward, but in Maharashtra, we have over the last 3-4 years worked out a detailed framework of how the state government can actually develop a system for universal healthcare. And while working with the government of Rajasthan, also we have come up with a similar set of recommendations. So I can tell you that today, many states in India, if there is political will, and that is of course a big if, but if there is political will, can develop UHC systems in the coming 5 years, which would be based on a combination of expanding and strengthening public health services and regulating private hospitals and private healthcare providers and bringing them under the UHC system so that they provide free healthcare, which is paid for by the government. So, well, we don't have time to discuss the details about a UHC system. It's a big topic, but I would say about half a dozen states in India today can adopt UHC within a few years. And Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Goa, are some examples of such states which are actually ripe to adopt the right to healthcare. And there are then another probably 10-15 states which include Maharashtra and Rajasthan, which can adopt the right to healthcare in the universal healthcare in the coming 5 years. So what we need to do is to start changing the discourse around right to healthcare and universal healthcare. And instead of saying how can it be done, we start saying it has to be done, and now we need to develop the modalities of operationalizing it, and work with governments and also build larger social mobilization to demand it. It's not a pipe dream. Thailand, Brazil, Sri Lanka, many other countries have done it, and we can do it in India if there is the political will. About COVID-19, yes, it is severely affecting ordinary people, especially marginalized, deprived communities across many states. And interestingly, sometimes it is said that the treatment is worse than the disease. So the lockdown uh, has often proved to be actually as detrimental or even more detrimental than the epidemic. And it has blocked people's access to healthcare, among many other things. As you know, you must be aware of all the other impacts, but among many of other negative impacts, it has often retarded or blocked. So we have had pregnant women delivering on the roadside because they could not reach a hospital because of the lockdown. We have children, elderly people, people with severe illnesses not being able to reach health facilities, or reaching health facilities and finding them locked or closed in the private sector, being shunted from one hospital to another because they refused to admit people. Someone who had a cough or a fever was just not admitted by various private hospitals, and then going to a public hospital and finding that all the beds are already full, and perhaps care is not available because they are overloaded. So and then geographical distances, Adivasi communities, remote rural areas have probably suffered more in the COVID-19 pandemic. So yes, it is a serious issue. We need to actually look at health rights in the COVID-19 pandemic and work for addressing many of these issues in a better way. So one way of doing it is actually to collect information and systematically feed this to governments. And we are actually initiating a process in about 4 or 5 states of a rapid response system in the context of the COVID-19 epidemic, working with the government and also working with civil society. So if you are interested, you can maybe contact me, and if in at least these 4 or 5 states, we are starting this immediately, and you can be part of the process. So to conclude with that, very much recommend that those participants which are interested in working on the right to health can be in touch with the Jan Swasthya Abhiyan or with Sathi, and also work on the patients' rights issues.
Thank you, Dr. Shukla. Just as a follow-up question with regard to universal free healthcare, like if you can share any example of a country we can look up to, and also the request of participants if you can share reading materials for the same, so they will be able to read and go through through all these things. And one final question, we have just 2 minutes left. Are there any legal provisions for monitoring the private healthcare systems in India?
Okay. Yeah. So UHC, I already mentioned Thailand and Sri Lanka as 2 examples. Sri Lanka is not very far from us. Sri Lanka has an excellent public health system, although it has been somewhat privatized in the past few years, but still it's a worthy example to look at. And you can definitely study the system there. And Thailand is probably a little closer to the Indian situation in the sense that it has a large private sector, but it has been brought under the UHC system. So even private hospitals provide free care to people as part of the UHC system, along with public hospitals. So probably in India, we'll have to go for something similar to the Thailand model, with of course many modifications and adaptations. So I would suggest that you can look at these 2 models which are within South Asia, Southeast Asia, and somewhat more relevant for the Indian situation. Coming to the issue about legal basis for monitoring private hospitals, well, we joke about the private health sector calling it a wrestler which is covered with oil. Tel laga hua pahalwan. It's very difficult to get a hold on it. It's a huge entity, as you saw in that slide of mine. It's a huge entity, but it's difficult to get a hold on it until now, because there is lack of regulation, there is lack of rights, and because there is lack of rights in an organized form, therefore it's difficult to regulate. But we have to overcome this situation, and there probably the Patients' Rights Charter is a good starting point. It is, well, not exactly legally binding, but definitely since the Union Health Ministry has circulated it to all states of the country, it is something which we can demand. And so far our experience has been, we have started monitoring the observance of Patients' Rights Charter. And if you use all those 17 rights, you get a pretty good set of rights. We have started monitoring this in some states, and we have found that private hospitals never refuse the rights, patients' rights in principle. At the most, they will say that, we'll do this later, or it's a little problematic right now, or something like that. But it's a good starting point to start monitoring what is happening in private hospitals. But the next step will have to be implementation of the Clinical Establishments Act, which is also there in many states of the country. And the Clinical Establishments Act provides a more robust platform, or it can at least potentially provide a more robust platform for monitoring private hospitals. But that is another next stage struggle. And as you probably know, 11 states across the country have adopted the Clinical Establishments Act at the central level, but it's not yet being implemented. So we need to actually take some steps to ensure that CEAs are implemented, and then private hospitals can be monitored much more effectively. But as a good starting point, we can start by monitoring the implementation of patients' rights in private hospitals. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and material, I'll send the material to you and to People's Watch, and you can circulate it to the participants, some key materials.
Thank you. That will be really helpful. And if there are any more questions for participants, we'll get back to you.
Yeah.
And you can just voice record and send, if you can send back your responses given your schedule and other things.
Yeah, I am not sure how much I will be able to do that. I am sending you my email address. It's in the chat box. So
Yes.
yeah, so you're welcome to contact me and write to me, and I will try to give you information. And any participants who are there from Maharashtra, I would especially encourage them to be in touch, because in Maharashtra we are planning a large scale activity during the COVID-19 situation and also beyond that. And interesting things are finally happening in the health sector in Maharashtra. unfortunately or fortunately due to the COVID-19 epidemic. So we are looking forward to developing a large scale campaign in the coming period in Maharashtra. So you're welcome to contact me.
Thank you, Dr. Shukla. Thank you very much for the time, for the very informative session you have just delivered. So thank you very much, and I'm sure it's going to be very helpful for all the participants. So we'll conclude here. We have just crossed the time.
Yeah.
So thank you one and all.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks to all the participants and to People's Watch for organizing this session. And yeah, look forward to being in touch.
Thank you. Thank you. We can all reconnect again starting from 3:30. Thank you very much.